Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Ross Young. Ross, thanks for being on again, man.
Hey, it's my pleasure for being here. I'm super excited.
Yeah, I can't remember if this is the second or third time, but needless to say, you've been on for a previous guest, and you and I have known each other for several years at this point. But for folks that don't know Ross, can you tell us a bit about your background and what you're up to?
Yeah, so I've spent 20 years in cybersecurity. 10 and a half of those years, I was at the Central Intelligence Agency working as a nation state actor and running DevOps programs. I also worked at Capital One for 2 years, so I got to experience the large scale data breach when that was there. And I was the CISO at Caterpillar Financial for 4 years. Most currently, I took a role in venture capital where I was the CISO in resident at Team8. And now I just focus on my own podcast called CISO Tradecraft.
Yeah, it's awesome to see you kind of step into that, because I know you've been associated with and working with CISO Tradecraft for some time, but due to your roles and stuff, you couldn't be front and center or as involved, I think, as you'd like to be. So I've been listening to the show for years myself and following the content and hearing your voice on there now. I'm like, this is awesome. Like, it's so cool to see you, just be part of the show and like in a way that you couldn't be in the past. And to your point about doing your own thing and focusing on some of your own endeavors, one thing you've been talking about lately, which will be the focus of the show today, is cybersecurity budgets. And I'm curious, why this topic? And then, from my perspective, I feel like it's one that it gets overlooked, honestly. Like, we hear a lot about, point solutions versus product or platforms. We hear about the latest, AI agents, agentic, except trends and, fair and quantifying risk and all these things. But when it comes to the budget, it's like no one really talks about it. Why is this topic so overlooked? And honestly, is that the reason you started kind of honing in on it?
Yeah. So what I found when I stepped into the role as the CISO is I was talking to no cyber folks above me. You are the pinnacle of cyber. You're talking to the chief financial officer, you're talking to chief legal, you're talking to the CEO, to the CIO. And most of those folks are not asking cyber questions you can't answer because you know more about cyber than they do, of course. But what they are asking is about the budget, about risks, about your program, about your strategy. And I found there were all these things that I hadn't really been taught in any technical class. And I'll just give you an example. Imagine you want to build whatever tool, your next gen MCP security solution, and you get $1 million. That's where the problem begins, not getting the money. The problem is, how do I get this through procurement? How do I do a master service license agreement with all these terms and conditions when the lawyers can't agree to things? And how to navigate some of those financial considerations are things I was like, I had no idea I would spend so much of my time as a CISO dealing with these issues. So I saw, there were a lot of books talking about confidentiality, integrity, availability, but no one was talking about how to master the budget, how to save your company millions of dollars, how to maximize the outcomes per dollar on every item in your cyber budget line.
Yeah, so I'm laughing and smirking because I'm like, yeah, I don't recall seeing these topics when I went through my CCI CISSP or cloud security certifications or even the CISO programs I've went through. They were all focused on risk and governance and all these kind of things, but not anything about budgets and managing a budget. And I feel like it's almost to the detriment of CISOs and security leaders because as there's a longstanding issue of showing return on security investment and justifying spend and things like that. And I feel like we're never really taught those kind of things. You kind of learn them on the fly. I'm curious, as you've started kind of going out there talking about this a bit more and writing about it, speaking about it, how has it been received so far by the community?
I think everybody loves it, right? And so you probably heard I'm writing a book called Cybersecurity's Dirty Secret: Why Most Budgets Go to Waste. And the whole focus is, here's a book that's going to be well under $50 that's going to teach you how to save your company thousands to millions of dollars. And what just a powerful ROI. And I'll just give you a little tidbit of a nugget from that chapter. We do one where CISOs walk into an organization, and the first thing I usually see them do is they look at all the tools and they'll say, why aren't you using my favorite tools? Right. And everybody has a preference. Maybe you like CrowdStrike, maybe you like Windows, whatever it is, doesn't really matter. But they'll come in and they'll try to replace like 4 or 5 tools with the tools that they're just familiar with from their last company. And the problem is now I have to go to the chief financial officer and I have to beg for more money. Hey, we're going to get off Windows Defender and we're going to go to CrowdStrike or whatever that switch is going to be. And basically now I have to, borrow money and the company has to bring money from somewhere that it didn't do before. And I think that's the wrong thing to do. What I think a CISO should really do is go to a company and create a murder board. How do I look at the 50, 80 tools that we're currently buying today to figure out what are the 5 tools we've never been able to deploy really well? We've never been able to turn on all the features, so we're not even getting the security from these tools that we expect. And if I get rid of these 5 tools, maybe I save the $1 or $2 million that then I can buy my 5 favorite tools. And now if you do it murder board first before you do the tool transition, you didn't have to beg money from the CFO. You found it within your own budget. So little tips and tricks like this, I think is how we become a masterful cybersecurity leader who can really transform organizations in a very positive way.
Yeah, I was going to dig a little deeper on that one with you because, the concept of the murder board and coming in, kind of looking to rationalize or at least optimize what's in place. I'm curious because, like, I feel like people, there's a switching cost as you laid out, from a procurement financial perspective, but there's also a switching cost from an organizational policy or process perspective. Maybe the workforce is very attuned to a certain tool and they're comfortable using it. That now they have to maybe learn a new tool or a product or a vendor because they all have their nuances in terms of UX, UI, configurations, etc. And then also, how do you navigate that if because you will come in and it's like, oh, look, they're just trying to change everything and they're trying to, roll out a new way of doing everything. And maybe the workforce, again, like they like what they have, or they're reluctant to make a change, or the financial side, like they're reluctant to make a change financially. Like, how do you kind of navigate that as a leader?
So the first thing I don't do is I don't go in and say, "Hey, all you guys are stupid. You made terrible decisions. Go fix these tools to the tools I like." That's just going to come off wrong. Can we agree to that? And so what I want to do is I want to show some data. And what I like to do is I like to show a couple of metrics. The first is coverage. So imagine you can list out the 50 different cybersecurity tools. We show coverage, which is how many endpoints or how many servers is this tool deployed on? Think of CrowdStrike. Is it deployed on 50% of the endpoints or 99% of the endpoints or 80% of the endpoints? That helps me really understand how much coverage I'm getting. The second thing I like to say is utilization. And so utilization is the important features that are turned on. And I'll just give you an example. I went to an organization and they had widely deployed the web application firewall. Good for them. Amazing. I think everybody agrees a WAF is going to stop some type of web application attacks. Let's do it. But what I actually found out is the developers just turned off all the rules on the WAF because, it made errors or had issues with their website. So they really had a neutered WAF that wasn't WAFing at all, if you will. So what's the point? So what I like to see is for each of these safeguards, these tools and solutions, how many of the important features have you turned on? And so let's just say there are 10 WAF rules that correspond with each of the OWASP top 10 web application attacks, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, continue. If I only turn on 80% of those rules, and I've only deployed my WAF on 70% of the endpoints or servers, then from there I can multiply those two together to get something like a effective protection score. And now I can rank and stack all of my different applications in my cybersecurity program and figure out where I've had failed deployments, where I haven't turned all the features on. And so I think I'm getting coverage, but I'm not really getting coverage behind the scenes because it's disabled. So those are the things I think that are super powerful. And just because your number's low doesn't mean get rid of the tool, right? Maybe you have a compliance requirements that you have to get it, and or maybe you just started year one and you have a lot more deployment to still do. But use that as a way to be informed, to figure out where you want to fix as an organization, and get that buy-in from the team to say, "Huh." It seems to me, just looking at this data, there's some challenges. What do you think we should be doing better here? And listen to that feedback and enable your team to have success.
Yeah, I think what you laid out there is so key. First off, is like coming in, not trying to rip everything out, actually, confronting the situation with data, right? So you're not just seeming opinionated, or, you're trying to just do things your way without, any rationale behind it. And again, getting feedback from the team is going to help kind of garner support for that approach and hear from them. What's working, what's not working, what have we always had trouble with, that kind of thing. And you kind of penned a piece recently. I don't even want to call it a controversial piece because it shouldn't be, but it was, you basically said most cybersecurity budgets are going to waste. And I wanted to ask you, why that is and what are the implications of that? Of course, there's financial implications. There's obviously risk implications. As you said, things may not be configured, tuned, optimized, delivering value or reducing risk for the enterprise. And I feel like this is like it shouldn't be controversial because it's confronting the reality that we all know, but people are reluctant to say because it is kind of like addressing our own inadequacies.
Yeah. So one of the things I find a lot of cybersecurity leaders doing is saying, how are we going to budget for next year? And usually it's something like, let's take last year's budget, let's add 3% for an inflation plus this one new project we got to launch. Let's call it AI security or whatever the buzzword is of the day. And then that's our new budget. And if last year's budget was lighting on fire, millions of dollars, and we didn't actually have good outcomes or we didn't do the right things and buy the right tools, adding 3% to that just sounds stupid to me. So, what I think we need to do is go to a zero based budget. And what I mean by that is I use this concept called total cost of ownership. How do we look at the labor costs plus the licensing costs plus the hosting costs to get a combined total cost of ownership for each application? A simple example. Let's say I have 10 people who work on the SIM, and each of those headcount costs me 150K. My labor costs are 1.5 million. I may have to pay, let's call it $1 million to Splunk for licensing fees. And then if I actually run Splunk on my own instance on AWS, there may be hosting costs associated. And once I start adding those all up together, I get something called a total cost of ownership. So maybe it's $2.5 million to run this SIM, right? Things like that. I can start to look tool by tool by tool to figure out what the cost is of each tool. And why this is super powerful is I can start to say, there should be some way to save some money. And one of the ways I like to do is to dig into the labor costs. Now, within the labor costs of 1.5 million across 10 developers, I like to say how many are using their time for new features versus operations and maintenance. And if 90% of the time is just maintaining that tool, only 10% is left for new features. And so I like to go to the team and say, how do we get out of this world of 90% maintenance that's just, stealing your hours to get to maybe 30% maintenance? That way I have 6 more developers to focus on building new features and automating alerts and things like that. And so then I go and I can figure out, hey, I want you guys to figure out what SIM 2.0 looks like for you. And they say, well, to do this, we'd have to go to Splunk 2.0 or whatever the new Splunk platform they prefer is. And they're going to say, look, it's $1.5 million transition costs to go to the new version. Got it. But if we're going to save, 6 headcount at 150K each, now that ROI, once I start dividing those things together, I can start to show that to the financial leaders. And if you're becoming more effective, reducing all those maintenance costs, you can do powerful things with your program. Your goal is to get to the minimum amount of maintenance time on each of your things so that you can rapidly innovate. And things like that is where I see a lot of transformation happening in the budgets once you start using this budget kung fu type activities.
Yeah, a few things there. I couldn't help but laugh. I come from the DoD space myself, and the phrase zero-based budgeting, was being thrown around a few years back. I forget by some acquisition leader due to DoD not passing a budget in quite a while, but we'll leave that topic alone. But and then you were talking about O&M and R&D, for example. I feel like these things are topics that get overlooked by security leaders, and then it kind of gets into that world of build versus buy, right? Because if you build, you have to kind of operate it, maintain it, sustain it. where if you buy it, often maybe a lot of that's being done by the vendor, but then you lose some control and autonomy. And like it's a sliding scale in each direction. And I was going to ask you as well, like, you talked about this in that piece, you lay out points such as, addressing material risks, looking at relevant threats and trends, measuring progress. Do you feel this is an activity that most CISOs and security leaders are doing when they look at their budget and kind of reconciling that, rationalizing it, and so on? I can't say in my experience that many take that rigorous approach. Like, as you said, they kind of just add on 3%, add on a budget for some new project. The budget always needs to be going up, right? Because just because, and it's like, there's no real hard look at, like, are we improving? Are we optimizing? What's our O&M versus R&D? These kind of things I feel like are not really looked at rigorously by security. And again, to our own detriment, because I'm sure it would help quite a bit with our financial and business peers.
I think we have to understand the bad actors have evolved their attacks, their tactics, procedures, all of those things. And that means our defenses have to evolve as well. Unfortunately, what I see is we keep buying more of the old legacy instead of evolving to, the new methods that truly safeguard. And just take the example of network security. Back in the 2000s, buying an IDS, buying an IPS was extremely popular. Everybody did it. And also a lot of firewall security was extremely popular. And now what you're seeing is, well, everything's encrypted in transit. So a lot of those things that we would look through just really aren't that helpful as much anymore. And yet I might be still, spending millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars on these tools and supporting these things. When if I switch to maybe a more modern approach, let's call it a SASE based approach, where everything is, encrypted to go to different places through tools like Zscaler and Netscope, we're going to see that that is probably a better way than some of the older technologies we may have chosen. And so what I like to do is I like to first start and take a threat informed approach. What are the top 3 to 5 material attacks or threats we think are going to happen to our organization next year? Probably things like phishing, having internet facing systems that are going to be popped, maybe identity based attacks. These are kind of things you might read from the Verizon data breach report. But it could be something unique to your own company. When I was at CIA, things like insider threat were always, a top concern for a lot of places. But, it's unique to your company. Maybe it's customer fraud or whatever it may be. So you start to put these material threats on one side. And this is where I actually created something called the OWASP Threat and Safeguards Matrix, where you go and lay down what would be the tools that would identify who is most likely or what tools are most likely to be impacted by this threat. Then how would I stop it or protect against that threat? And then if I couldn't stop it, how would I detect? How would I respond and recover? And when you take this threat informed view, what you actually get to see is maybe all these technologies that you're buying don't actually stop the top 3 to 5 material threats to your organization. And so you're focused on building defenses against the wrong problems, which is an expensive task to go down. So I always like to say, what threats are we trying to stop? And then build my defenses around that. So then I optimize the best way to reduce harm to my company.
Yeah, I like a lot of things you said there. One is like, and again, this is in the article you talked about. I love reading reports like DBIR, M-Trends, Scientia. It has some great reports to see like what are the leading attack vectors, things like that. Because as exciting as it is to think about post-quantum encryption or LLM data poisoning and some of these like nuanced, obscure things that can happen. The fact is, it's still phishing, it's still vulnerability exploitation, it's still compromised credentials that are leading the way in spades, in terms of attack vectors in the industry. And then the framework that you laid out and you have created with OWASP is really excellent. I often think of it in terms of, it's similar to, Sunil Yu's cyber defense matrix, looking at that and seeing like how am I, protect, defend, respond, recover, et cetera, from a security tech stack and capability perspective. And you said something that made me think of my next question for you is, you talked about legacy tools and methodologies and things like that. A hot topic in the last several years, especially, against the backdrop of maybe stagnating security budgets or economic headwinds and things like that, has been the point product versus platform debate, right? Or best of breed versus platform conversation. And I don't think one is right or wrong. I don't, is there always a space to find efficiencies and find the right tool? Maybe it's, again, one of your most pressing threats. You need best of breed, or maybe it's an area where you can afford to have a platform, and having maybe not the best of breed capability in certain categories is okay. But they're never going to be one tool to rule them all. As you know, there's just too many categories and challenges in cybersecurity as well. So I'm curious how you think about that topic.
Usually you're trading two options. One is the point product tends to have more features and capabilities, versus the platform play usually has better integrations between all the tools. And if you go back to my earlier example of the total cost of ownership, let's just take the example of application security. Most organizations today, they buy a SaaS tool, they buy a software composition analysis tool, they buy a DAS tool, and a vuln management tool, and then they have to put them all into one umbrella tool to, let's say, prioritize all of the vulns in one place for developers. Now, I might buy each of those different tools from different vendors, and then I have to buy another tool as an integrator, or maybe I build that internally. Take the example of the total cost of ownership. What is the total cost from each of these things we have to build? And if it's cheaper to do it as a platform play where, your labor cost is significantly reduced, maybe your licensing cost is reduced by getting one application security posture management tool that does all of them instead of buying 5 individual tools. Now you can start to compare the price versus the features. And what you may see is, hey, I actually get 90% of the features in this platform play. It's actually $1 million cheaper on the total cost of ownership because the labor costs and licensing costs added. So yeah, I'm all in on CrowdStrike, or all in on Palo Alto, or whatever your favorite platform is. I think that is a completely valid way and an approach to go down. And if you felt that, oh, you know what, I just absolutely have to have this feature and I can't get it in the platform, well, that may direct you towards the other way. So there is no right organization for every company, but I think using the template like the total cost of ownership and then making those budget informed decisions makes a lot of sense. So if you're looking for that template, you can download it on CISO Tradecraft. We have a free template section that's super helpful so that you can start using it in your budget planning this year.
Yeah, I'll be linking to those resources in the show notes for folks to check out. And on that same topic, similar to the piece that you wrote about the wasted cybersecurity budgets, I had wrote an article a while back, and I feel like it shouldn't be a spicy take, but I call it kind of the elephant in the room, and I dubbed the article like "Our security tools are making us insecure." Often, on one hand, it's due to the fact that we talked about the security tool sprawl. Like it said, large enterprises. I've read different numbers, but it's several hundreds of security tools, right? That they're managing. And as we talked about throughout the conversation, many of them aren't configured, tuned, optimized, integrated, delivering value, reducing risk for the organization. So there's that aspect of it. And then also I feel like and maybe it's just me, but as I watch like CISA advisories and things like that, headlines and so on, I feel like more and more we're seeing incidents and exploitation activity involving security tools because they're highly privileged. They have access to sensitive data. We've seen numerous of these in the last like 24 months alone of large security vendors being compromised. And then that, lets you move laterally, lets you see vulnerabilities, it lets you see, sensitive data and so on. What are your thoughts of like security tools being part of the attack surface basically? And, how we manage that, as you've been talking about throughout the conversation, exposing the organization to more risk basically.
I think it's a matter of time till this happens again. So just take the example of a antivirus or an endpoint detection response. It's deployed on every endpoint in your organization, hopefully. Well, doesn't that sound like a good place to put malware? Like if I could put a malicious signature into CrowdStrike's EDR and it deploys on every endpoint, well, now I have access to do bad things to every endpoint. So I'm sure attackers are going to put that type of mindset to things and say, how do I, leverage these existing connections capabilities to do things, right? And this is where we're just going to have to be very mindful and have a lot of monitoring, right? How do we make sure if bad actors are turning off these things or maybe using them to harm the system, right? What if I could just use the antivirus to disable all of your executives' devices? Like, that sounds like a pretty bad denial of service attack as well coming. So I think we are likely to see some of those things in the future. I don't know when. I'm not like a forecaster, but it certainly makes sense from my mind of, yeah, if I wanted to cause a lot of harm, anything that runs as root or has kernel level permissions is probably a really viable, attractive target to start doing some research on.
Yeah, I think just intuitively, these are very enticing targets for malicious actors, and I think they're waking up to that reality, and and there's an increased pressure from a security vendor's perspective. Like, having an incident as a security vendor is like not good, right? Like, it's a damaging aspect to your trust in the industry and community. So there's that added pressure too on the vendors as well. So you talked about this a little bit earlier. Your book, Cybersecurity's Dirty Secret: Why Most Budgets Go to Waste. Can you tell us a bit about the book? When we should be looking out for it, where we can find it, that kind of thing, as we wrap up the conversation here.
Yeah, so I promise to have the book released before the end of the year. Right now, I'm just going through a couple of things where I'm getting some last minute recommendations by some friends on the back of the book. And then once I get that done, then I'll release it. And I'm also recording an audiobook in case people prefer to listen to Audible or on their drive or something like that. What I will say is if you want an early peek, we have actually used the book to create an online course that I know Chris is going to put a link in the show notes, but it's a good way where you can get videos as well as the templates to use, as well as the chapter readings from the book. So that's a really good way if you want an early sneak peek before the book comes out by the end of the year.
Yeah, I'll be putting that in the show notes and the comments for folks on LinkedIn as well. I'll be checking out the course. I've been looking out for the book. I think it's a topic, like I said, it's not discussed enough, and I think it's something as the CISO and security leadership field, kind of continues to grow and mature and evolve. It's going to be a topic I think we're going to have to confront and really get some mastery of. So this is a long-needed resource, in my opinion. And I appreciate you coming on again, Ross. Like I said, known you for several years, and it's awesome to see you doing your own thing now. And I have nothing but the most respect for what you're up to.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure to come on the show. Chris, we've been friends for years, so I love what you're doing. I love how you've also written books on vulnerability management and others. And I think that's an important part of the tradecraft here is how do you give back? How do you make sure we're all sharing our lessons with each other? Because if Chris knows the secret to protecting my organization, I want to learn it from him. And hopefully if I have something that helps people save thousands to millions of dollars on their cybersecurity budget, come to me and learn it from me. We all win when we continue to learn. And that's really what cybersecurity is about. Nothing is static. You have to constantly be learning to help defend your organization.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. And that's the whole purpose of this show, is so I can learn from talking to people and share that while I'm talking to folks as well. So again, thanks so much, Ross, for jumping on, and thanks to everyone who tuned in as well. Take care.